Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Foreign Policy Virtual Dialogue. My name is Reimagining, and it's my pleasure to be your host this morning. Climate change and increasingly extreme or unpredictable weather patterns are really key drivers of both internal migration and displacement. These environmental pressures often play out against a backdrop of social, political, and economic instability, all in the context of many developing countries. There's weak infrastructure. Governance exacerbated those pressures on communities as people become uprooted, some seasonal migrants, others climate refugees. And we can see an increased threat to our livelihood, economies disrupted, and an elevated potential for even regional conflict. Here's an incredible statistic. By 2050, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia will all generate an estimated 143 million more climate migrants. Worldwide, more than 1 billion people will live in countries with insufficient physical and social infrastructure to withstand climate change. So in today's conversation, we're going to explore how governments and internal development communities can respond, international communities can sort of respond to the challenge of climate migration. What exactly do you think can be done to mitigate the social and the economic disruptions in both communities and communities of origin, as well as receiving communities? We're going to look into how data-driven forecasts, risk management approaches, and local capacity building is being utilized to build resilience, particularly in regions most vulnerable to climate change. I want to thank all of you for tuning in today, and a really big thanks to Chemonics for partnering with us on this program. I've got a couple of housekeeping things I want to tell you about before we get started. We want to make sure that we hear from all of you and that you have a chance to participate. We've got a bunch of ways that you can do that. And one of them, as you know, for all of you familiar with Zoom, you can click on the Q&A button that's below under the submit. You can see submit a question and answer. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that, the Q&A button there. When you do, be sure to leave your name, your organization, and where you're writing from. We'd love to connect and let people know where you're coming from. And if you're joining us via phone or you want to watch the live stream, you can email us your questions. The address is events@foreignpolicy.com. That's events@foreignpolicy.com. And of course, we encourage you to chime in also on social media and do use the hashtag Mitigating Climate Migration. So I'm delighted to start the program with our first guest, Congressman Joaquin Castro, who unfortunately couldn't join us live, but we had a chance to catch up and connect before to discuss some of the issues and the impact that he's been seeing from climate change and forced migration in his district, and also what can Congress do to make a difference. So Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm curious, how has climate change impacted your district?
Well, if you look at the thousands of people from Central America, specifically the Northern Triangle, who have been affected by climate events, hurricanes, earthquakes, some of these folks are climate refugees. Some of them, of course, are also fleeing very harsh violence. But some of them have been motivated to move, to leave their home country by weather events, by climate events. And so San Antonio is about 2.5 hours from the border. And we're a city that's always taking folks in, asylees and refugees. And so that's one direct way in the last several years that my district has been impacted. But also, if you look back at 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit, and there were literally over 100,000 people, probably 200,000 people from New Orleans that came to either Houston or San Antonio. And that was, again, a time when my city, San Antonio, really welcomed many people who were suffering the effects of a severe climate event.
So you can really point to seeing the effects of migrant patterns based on climate change.
Oh, absolutely. And it's something that as a nation and really as a world, we have not reckoned with at all.
Do you have a sense of how you reckon with it? What do you do when you're seeing this massive influx of migrants based on climate change?
Well, the first thing is that we have to fully acknowledge that climate refugees exist, that the main driver of migration for some people and some families are climate events. And we have not fully, as an international community, reckoned with that, admitted it, and then defined it, put it into our definition of what it means to be a refugee. if you think about it, I think the way we think about refugees and asylees still, I think, is kind of stuck in past decades, where we thought of somebody that was fleeing a communist country or a communist dictator. Of course, we accepted many folks who fled Vietnam, for example, in the mid 1970s, which we should have done as a nation. But there are other things besides oppressive governments or political leaders who can cause people to leave their homelands. And climate events are some of those things.
Are there any programs that you feel are working in dealing with climate migrants?
You know, it's something, unfortunately, that the United States has not taken head on, and the world, I feel, most of the world is even further behind. And so I hope at COP26, for example, that's coming up in a few days, that this will be a primary issue of discussion, is how the world starts to acknowledge climate refugees and starts to make this a fundamental piece of our refugee policy.
How do you think that programs and investments should be created to help with this situation?
Well, I think multilateral institutions like the United Nations and then regional institutions should take a lead role. But then, of course, nations around the world like the United States should play a leading role in acknowledging and then strategizing on climate refugees. And most of all, redefining who we consider to be a refugee, to acknowledge that people are fleeing these severe weather events.
Do you think that technology in Texas plays a role in dealing with the Texas climate migration and also the migration efforts?
Yeah, certainly. Texas is a leader in many different kinds of technologies. And one of the things at places like USAID and the State Department is trying to figure out how we innovate better to combat these challenges. And my home state of Texas is really on the forefront of much of that innovation, and the universities, the research institutes, all of it. But I do think that the energy needs to be applied in a very focused way. We really have to focus our efforts on climate refugees.
I want to ask you a little bit about the Paris Agreement. You know, back in March 2021, in an article in the Texas Signal, you expressed your optimism now that the U.S. is back in the Paris Agreement, and you stated that policymakers should look for ways to incentivize nations to do their part to solve the climate crisis. What do you think What do you think that the incentives should look like?
Yeah, I think that's right. The United States should take the lead role in getting the world to acknowledge climate refugees and incentivize nations to accept climate refugees. Well, the first thing that we can do ourselves as a nation is be a North Star for that, and really start as a country to do it ourselves. I think that would have an incredible effect around the world in encouraging other nations to follow suit. But whether it's monetary incentives, development incentives, or otherwise, we've got to be on the forefront in helping the world figure out how we deal with this. We know that climate change is worsening. Even with our best efforts in the coming decades, that's still going to be true for the next many years. And so we've got to figure out a way, when you've got more people that are going to be migrating because of climate, figure out a way to accommodate folks, to accept that they are in as dire a situation as somebody who may be fleeing a very oppressive political leader somewhere in the world. And until we do that, I feel like we're falling further and further behind.
You know, you've made it such a good point in this interview of saying how for so long we've looked at migrants based on maybe they're escaping communism, but not so much from the climate angle of this all. What are the gaps that you feel the current US climate legislation just doesn't acknowledge in this moment?
Well, it's taking that final step. And, President Biden did something very important, which was to get the United States government to actually study the issue of climate refugees. That in itself is a very positive step. But you got to go from, I think, studying it to finally taking affirmative policy steps to incorporate it into our definition of refugee. And I still think, as I mentioned, that we think of people who are fleeing a communist dictator, or really specifically political leaders and nations that we've usually gone to war with or been close to going to war with, like Cuba. We think people fleeing those countries, that's what we traditionally have considered refugees. But the fact is, if you look around the world, people are fleeing because of non-state violence. That's the case with Central America, also in the Northern Triangle, where you have these oppressive drug gangs that are threatening to kill people. And you've got folks that are leaving and trying to come to the United States as asylum seekers. But many of those folks have also been affected by severe climate events. And so that's a main driver of migration as well. We see the same thing in parts of Africa, for example. And so this has got to be an approach that's, of course, tailored to regional needs, but really it's got to be an approach that the world takes of redefining refugee.
If you were tasked with sort of reimagining climate migration and how the United States could make a difference, what do you think some of your first initiatives might be to kick that off?
So I hope that the United States government will, of course, study the issue some more, but take action most of all. I think that it's promising if we can actually pull it off, that there will be money in the reconciliation bill for some of this. And so study it, but most of all, take action on it. That includes an appropriation to address this issue. And then when we do interact with multilateral institutions, whether it's the United Nations or another one, and also when our leaders are at these international conferences like COP26, we have to make sure that this is a priority issue when we talk about anything related to the environment, to climate, and so forth. Because you can talk about different climate issues without necessarily talking about refugees. We've seen it happen many times before. So this has to be centered in the discussions going forward.
Are there examples of governments that have worked together both internally and externally to combat climate migration where you feel it's been a success?
I don't want to say that nobody has been successful, but really, as I've looked at it, I just haven't seen the kind of coordination and collaboration that you would expect, given the challenge of this, really what is a migration crisis in different parts of the world. Unfortunately, the issues of immigration, asylum seeking, refugees can be some of the thorniest issues politically that a government will deal with. And I feel as though oftentimes in that politics gets lost the fact that you're dealing with real human beings, and often they're suffering. And we just haven't seen the kind of collaboration that I wish that we could have. Now, I may be missing different examples out there, which is quite possible, but those examples where they exist need to become, if they've been successful, need to become the models and need to be scaled up where they can be.
Why do you think it's taken us so long to really understand the issues of climate migration and why it's such a big problem for us?
Well, there's still a challenge in our country in the political dialogue of getting some folks to even admit that climate change is real. You remember for the last decade or a dozen years, now it seems mostly settled, but really for about 10 years, there was this real heavy debate going on about whether climate change was even real. And so you go from there, if you can't admit something is real, then it's harder to go into the sub issues within that challenge. And this is one of those issues. And we've been dealing with when we talk about climate, we've been dealing with other issues of climate, mitigation, for example, whether we should still be part of the Paris Climate Accord, which is a more, a political issue that filled the dialogue for about 4 years during President Trump's term. So climate refugees, that issue has taken a back seat to a lot of the more pressing, what would be considered by many more pressing political discussions.
You've been part of this dialogue for some time about climate and looking into migration patterns. But beyond that, where do you think that the United States can really have the most impact when you're talking about climate issues? Is there something that you're passionate about that you think we can really make a difference in this particular area?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's different things. Number one is mitigation effects. And so we want to make sure that we're part of the Paris Climate Agreement. We want to make sure as a country that we are being a leader and a model in how we reduce the effects of climate change here. That's why I've been so excited about the prospect of real action in the reconciliation bill on climate change. That's still, of course, up in the air about whether we're going to be able to do it successfully or not. But the fact even that you saw an aggressive proposal to do it tells me that whether it happens in 2021 or 2022 or a few years from now, I believe that in the next several years, the United States is going to take much more aggressive action to reduce the effects of climate change. And we'll do that through the Congress, again, whether it happens now or later. So the most powerful thing that we can do is to be a North Star for the world in taking action ourselves. I think that will set the tone for what many nations do in the coming decade.
Congressman, you made such a good point about how, there are just people in Congress who do not believe that this is really a problem. How do you convince your colleagues who take a very different viewpoint than you do about how dire this situation really is on climate?
It's been tough over the years. And I do think that more people are now convinced than, say, 10 years ago about how real climate change is, including more members of Congress. But many admit it begrudgingly. And it's one thing to admit something, and it's something altogether different to finally take action on it and to fund the initiatives to combat climate change and to do something about climate refugees. And so I've had different personal conversations over the years with folks that would be considered climate deniers, for example. But most of all, I would ask people to watch the events that we've seen over the course of the last 5-10 years and the severe climate events that we're dealing with as a nation and that other parts of the world are dealing with. Even in my home state of Texas, Houston, Texas has continually been hit by major flooding. Seems like every few years. And so you don't have to look far from home for any of us to see the effects of climate change around us.
So just to wrap it up, in your opinion, what do you feel like some of the additional steps that can be taken that could really make a difference in combating climate change?
For the United States to go to COP26, but also to press the issue in other international forums that climate refugees are real, that we need to make sure that we accommodate them, and then to take action to put that into statute in the United States and use that as a marker to help set the trend around the world and to properly fund the initiatives that we need to deal with this phenomena, because it's only going to get worse in the coming years. And we have to be prepared for it. And we have to do right by people by acknowledging it and taking action.
Congressman, thanks so much for joining us.
Of course. Great to see you.
Congressman Joaquin Castro, thank you very much. And as the Congressman mentioned, the White House has been looking into climate change and just issued a new report. We've got panelists on the ground the second half of our program that we're going to be talking to about initiatives that can be taken already in various communities globally. But first, I want to turn now to another pre-recorded session. I got a chance to speak to Mayor Yvonne Aki Sawyer. She is, in fact, the mayor, you see right there, of Freetown, Sierra Leone. Our conversation focused on the impacts of changing weather patterns at the local government and community levels. And what has Freetown been doing to support climate smart development? What sort of regional or international collaborations or partnerships have really helped the mayor in these efforts? So let's hear from Freetown Mayor Aki Sawyer. And joining us now is the mayor of Freetown in Sierra Leone, Mayor Yvonne Aki Sawyer. Mayor, thanks again for joining us. I want to ask you to kick it off. How do you think the climate crisis has impacted Sierra Leone? And in Freetown, have you seen migration patterns change because of climate change?
Thanks so much, Rena. And yes, I'll start with the second bit of the question. I believe we really are definitely seeing an impact. And that impact is felt through the process of rural-urban migration. We see a lot more people coming into the city. We don't have the hard data yet, but we've just commissioned a survey to try and get that figure. We do know anecdotally that the numbers of people coming in have increased and that their destinations are the informal settlements, which are swelling, putting a real pressure on the delivery of services, but also increasing vulnerability to the very thing that's causing the move. And what's causing the move? the abnormal weather patterns, the flooding, the rain coming in the wrong season, affecting crop production. And given that 65% of our population in the country are actually involved in subsistence agriculture, it means there's a high degree of vulnerability for that segment of the population. So they then move into the city where, because of an absence, among other things, an absence of development control, namely land use planning and a building permit system. It's currently held by the Ministry of Lands. It's currently centralized, which means it's not effective. In fact, you could argue that it's not really even existent. But in the absence of that, what you see is this mushrooming of informal settlements, which tend to be along the coastline, which means the people moving there are susceptible to flooding coming from coastal surges, obviously on a longer term sea level rises. But the other real area of vulnerability is the fact that a number of them will find themselves living along the hillsides, where the city is surrounded by hills on the one side, and then the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, on the other. And those hills tend to be quite steep. And, those settling in informal settings, creating informal settlements along the hillsides are very, very vulnerable to landslides and mudslides, and these happen quite regularly. Now, the other point, again, because of the lack of development and building control, something we are advocating to have devolved to the city, so that, and to local councils generally, so that it can be better executed and implemented, as it's going to be more and more critical as we see climate change. So what I've just described is very Freetown focused, but I think I've also kind of alluded to how the rest of the country is affected, from the perspective of crop failure, agriculture, and even these same vulnerabilities are felt in urban settings outside of Freetown, as well as in some rural settings. I must actually mention something else, and that's that the vulnerability of the rural urban migrants is sometimes increased. It's definitely not improved. But the other thing that happens is the vulnerability of the city as a whole is also negatively impacted, because with that uncontrolled development of informal settlements comes along with it extensive deforestation. And that's also true along the coastline, where you have the banking of mangrove, both resulting in increasing the vulnerabilities, reducing biodiversity. So I would say, in short, quite a lot of impact, and not good.
In your opinion, how do you think that programs and investments should be changed to better fit the needs of a community?
So thanks for that, Rena. So I would say everything we do as government, and I think it sort of is in sharper focus at local government level, but of course it's also true as well of central government. Everything must be about community. It's about the people. And so when we look at the challenges that we have now, to answer that question, it's really to answer the question, what's not working? And I would say that we have to improve access to resources. I just made mention of the situation with the failure of effective devolution and decentralization of functions which are foundational and fundamental to urban management, and therefore directly impacting the lives of those living in our cities and beyond. But it's not just about the political mandate and the political space. That is of significance importance. It's very, very important. It's probably the starting point. But the other piece, which kind of goes alongside that, is access to resources. So whether it's ensuring that there is space for own source revenue collection, property rates, in our case, being a major part of our portfolio of own source revenue, or whether it is with access to funding coming from multilaterals, philanthropists, etc. There's currently a recognition, and increasingly so, that we don't have the right framework for access to resources for and on behalf of cities. That there's too much red. Well, I don't want to say red tape, because when people say remove the red tape, you almost feel as though you don't want to follow process. I think there are just too many hurdles, and the structure which requires, with so many funding mechanisms, a city to access funding through national government is problematic. So I would say making sure that the functions which are best delivered by local authorities are devolved to those local authorities, not only on paper, as in our case, but also in practice, but also making sure resources are available. Private sector resource, public sector resource, and of course, even the city's own, having the space to collect its own revenue.
Are there any examples of climate smart development in Freetown?
Yes. So we have a nature-based solution which forms a significant part of our climate action portfolio. Not the only one, clearly, but a very significant part, and which is our Freetown the Tree Town campaign to plant 1 million trees over 3 rainy seasons. And the smart element, the technology element there, comes from the fact that in order for us to not only plant but to grow those trees, we've developed in partnership with a company called Greenstand a unique tree tracker app. So every tree that is planted, and it's very community driven, community owned. We have community based growers, so it's creating jobs. We have tree stewards, so we have that sort of sense of involvement of just ordinary residents of the city. But what's significant and what's smart is that every tree that's planted has a tracking number which is entered into this app, and the tree's growth is tracked and monitored by a community-based organization. They have smartphones, and that information goes to a database, and every 2 months the growth of the tree is monitored through the uploading of pictures, and payments, mobile money payments, are made to the growers through that. So I think that's an example of a climate action which is smart.
Mayor, what role, if any, does technology play in mitigating Freetown's climate challenges?
So I've just described the Tree Tracker app, which is part of our Freetown the Tree Town project, which obviously, but which, since it's a nature-based solution which is leading to an increase in the carbon sink, is part of what we're doing to combat climate change. But another major element of our climate action is our work around sanitation. I'm really trying to increase from 21% and 6% of solid and liquid waste collection to at least 60% for both of those. And this is another area where technology has come in. We developed it's an app, but it's also a web-based portal called www Find Me in Freetown, where we register all service providers, waste service providers, enabling customers, residents of our city to very quickly and easily find out who collects garbage in their area, since we have a very decentralized waste collection framework or system. The other elements for where technology are supporting our sanitation work is with our helpline, our 8244 number, which customers can use, residents can use to lodge complaints, feeds into a database, enables our enforcement teams to go out. All of these are significant elements of climate action because waste is a big emitter for us, and they're really technology based. There are other elements of this when it comes to raising revenue with our newly digitized property rate system. And I think I'm mentioning this when you talk about climate because, as we said before, access to funding is part of what's needed to effectively address climate change and come up with the funding for the mitigation and adaptation strategies that we want to implement.
What role do you think the international community and donors can play in creating these programs? And also, how successful have they been? And I'm wondering, how do you think these partnerships can be improved?
So I really think it's important that we recognize that we shouldn't have donors and international community creating programs for anyone. Programs need to be created within country. It needs to be owned by the communities, by city leaderships, by national leaderships. And what we should be talking about is partnership and the recognition, as we said before, that where there are funding gaps, there is the space and the opportunity to work with partners, international communities, donors, etc., in order to fill those gaps, those funding gaps. Sometimes there's technical expertise that could be usefully harnessed through synergies, but ownership is key. And so I'd just like to reframe that a little bit and say, yes, there's a place for partnership, but the ownership, the lead needs to come from, the beneficiary. So whether it's at a community level, local government level, or national government level. Thanks.
How do you think the C40, the MMC Global Mayors Task Force on Climate and Migration, created opportunities and collaboration between regions that are facing similar climate challenges? And can you give me a sense of some of the collaboration that's happened?
So the C40 MMC Task Force on Climate Migration, I think has come at a very, very important time, a time in which we are increasingly recognizing the interplay between these two things, the extent to which climate-induced migration is already happening and is projected to continue to happen. One of the key deliverables of the task force was the creation of these 10 guiding principles, principles that we as individual mayors have committed ourselves to, we've signed up to, and which we're seeking to amplify. Principles which include having people at the center of climate action, being inclusive and equitable, ensuring that we pursue and share data information, and also just making sure that as we look at the national and international policies around funding, that we are tackling those the challenges I highlighted earlier on about access to funding at the city level to deal with climate action, to deal with migration. And on a really practical level, we come from different parts of the world, and in our interactions, we're able to learn, share experiences, and learn from each other.
Mayor Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rena. It was my pleasure.
Pretty remarkable to see some of the innovation coming out of Sierra Leone. Mayor Aki-Sawyer, Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, I want to thank you very much for joining us. And now that helps us set the stage for our next part of this conversation, perspectives from government. We've got an incredible panel of experts you see right there who are going to help us better understand how global development programs have been prioritizing climate migration and capacity building strategies around the globe. We're going to talk a little bit about what's working, what's needed to be scaled, and how do you integrate those efforts with larger sustainable development objectives. I want to welcome to the program, you see right there on the left, Jamie Montgomery, who is the Division Chief for Resilient Communities and Systems with USAID, the Center for Resilience. We are also joining us, Justin Giannetti, Senior Officer for Information Management and Risk Analysis for the International Federation of the Red Cross, and Chris Perrine, who is the Director of Corporate Environmental Sustainability from Chemonics. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Jamie, I want to get right to you. One of the things as we were discussing and preparing for this panel, we're talking a little bit about how today's conversation will sort of frame the challenge of climate change as a driver of migration and displacement. But there's also a lot driving migration and displacement. Do you want to get into a little bit about that?
Sure. I just want to thank you, Foreign Policy Magazine and Chemonics for inviting me to this very important conversation. So, we know that evidence linking climate trends and human mobility shows that climate change is increasingly contributing to migration and displacement. We know that climate impacts on food and water security, sea level rise, intensifying extreme events, and disasters impact livelihoods and reduce livability, contributing to increased mobility. But as many who work on these issues know well, why, how, and when people move is really complex. So in response to climate impacts, mobility ranges from a proactive adaptation strategy. For example, people might choose to move to urban areas to seek off-farm income on a seasonal basis, to make up for diminishing crop yields at home, or ranging to forced displacement in the face of life-threatening risks. So this mobility can be temporary, seasonal, or more permanent. And further, we know that most mobility in response to climate impacts has and is likely to continue to occur internally, that is within the country of origin. But critical to the discussion of climate-related migration is the recognition that climate impacts are an additional stress on communities that are already facing a myriad of pressures that we've heard from the previous speakers, such as limited economic opportunities, social or political marginalization, insecurity, and poor governance, just to name a few. And while we recognize that climate drivers are increasingly a factor in this mobility, we absolutely cannot lose sight of these other pressures that people are facing. And so to best support households and communities, we really do need to recognize the range of these pressures and address them in a holistic manner, which I think was also cited by our prior speakers. So, in our increasing recognition of the role that climate is playing in migration, we do want to not lose sight of the fact and overlook the other critical support that communities require to thrive in place. And then I think lastly, the point I wanted to make on this particular question is that we do need to remember that mobility is one of humanity's oldest adaptation strategies. So really, supporting people who wish to move as a proactive adaptive strategy really can serve to increase resilience and hopefully prevent those situations where people feel that they're forced to move. Thank you.
Jamie, thank you very much. I want to turn to Justin Giannetti. Justin, I'd love to get the International Red Cross's perspective on this. How do you harness your expertise in forecasting and your on-the-ground expertise to sort of manage risk when it comes to climate threats?
Thanks very much. And thanks to Foreign Policy for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. Climate change can seem like an abstract topic, or this can be seen as perhaps at a remove temporally or spatially from one's day-to-day existence. But climate-related displacement risk is something that people in every single country around the world face. So the IFRC and the National Societies of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement are been around for 100+ years, are present in 192 countries, and we're there before, during, and after crises occur. So what we're doing is we're leveraging our scale and our capacity to be there to scale up anticipatory action to help communities build resilience before events occur, and to help recover once they have occurred. And it really speaks to the point that Mayor Aki Sawyer mentioned about really having community-led solutions and community-owned solutions to the challenges that they face.
Thank you so much, Justin. I want to turn to Chris Perrine to talk a little bit about those solutions. Chris, how does a company like Chemonics generate tailored solutions to really improve climate resilience? You've got specific geographic areas, specific development sectors. How do you manage to find those solutions that work?
Yeah. So again, thank you, Foreign Policy, for organizing this event, and to my co-panelists for their perspectives, and for the earlier speakers for their words of wisdom. The answer is it's difficult. And, as has been discussed by various speakers today, the dynamics are complex. I think we all agree that changing climate is a threat multiplier on top of, governance issues, economic issues, social issues, et cetera. And the extent to which climate is a driver of human movement, and particular displacement in the near term and migration in the longer term, is really hard to quantify. So what we do is, we do the best with the information we have to provide, practical, actionable solutions that help people to feel more secure, to protect or improve their livelihoods. And as Jamie said, to relocate when that is something that they desire to do, and that becomes an adaptation measure in and of itself. So what we do is, we first try and frame the question what are we trying to, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Are we trying to look at, livelihoods of communities in a particular area? Are we looking at a particular economic growth sector like agriculture? And how are we trying to make those communities or sectors more resilient? And so we use a variety of climate vulnerability assessment approaches to answer that question. And then we'll marry that to other forms of data. And in particular, with respect to human movement, we do know that governance issues, and in particular, governance stability, or on the flip side, fragility, are contributors to human movement. And so we will sometimes, when we're doing climate vulnerability assessment, we'll also look at governance data and try and look at things like political economy analyses or other data that give us some insights on governance to see where things might be aligned in kind of a negative way, where we have high climate vulnerability and high fragility, and therefore where we may, see the conditions for undesirable migration in the medium and long term, and then try and put in place adaptation responses, climate adaptation responses that can help to mitigate that undesirable migration.
Chris, I keep hearing that over and over again throughout these panels here at Foreign Policy, the importance of data and how that can make such a difference. I want to remind everyone out there in the audience that we'd love to hear from you. You can submit questions via the Q&A box right there on Zoom. And you can also send your questions via social media with the hashtag Mitigating Climate Migration. And speaking of questions, we've got one right here. It's from Ann Moisen. Anne is asking, how do you deal, and I think, Jamie, I'm going to toss this to you, how do you deal with the extreme climate migration cases, like, for example, Maldives, where there's an entire country that will need to be relocated as their country disappears? Jamie, any sense of how you deal with something like that?
Well, I mean, I think that is a challenging situation. And while we do definitely work to partner with countries to really strengthen their ability to adapt to sea level rise and other climate related stressors. I mean, I think we recognize that yes, there will be some situations, like what was described, where you might need to be in the future looking at planned relocation opportunities, I guess. And so I think from that perspective, that is really a question for some of my other colleagues at State Department and other agencies to really think about holistically, like what we need to be doing to address some of these situations where people will need to make permanent choices.
Mm-hmm. Justin, I've got another question. This one coming from Derek Canham. And Derek is asking, given that negative impact of climate change affects women and youth differently, how can we include women and youth specifically when addressing the negative impact of climate migration? What are the specific policies when you're talking about climate migration that can make a difference?
Thanks very much. It's actually a great question because it gets to the heart of one of the key issues, which is that when you think about people, the tens of millions of people who are being displaced each year by disasters, it's not a group of people en masse. These are distinct individuals who are being displaced, and there are real differences between when the experiences of men, women, and children when they are displaced in terms of the vulnerabilities they faced on their while displaced or on a migratory pathway, or for as long, or as it relates to how long they may be displaced, when and where and why they return home, and so on and so forth. And it's really important that we can get disaggregated data on the populations who are on the move so that we can better address these vulnerabilities. Because at the moment, right now, the data that's traditionally obtained on these populations on the move doesn't allow for easy understanding of who these people are or what their particular needs are that they face while in transit. So basically, more data on the characteristics of people who are on the move is needed in order to really answer that question with the precision it requires.
Chris, I've got a question for you now from Allison Hall, who's saying, you talk about the importance of data. How do you use geospatial and satellite data in climate adaptation or migration?
Yeah, so we use it pretty extensively, in two ways. First of all, as an analytical tool. A lot of climate data, in particular satellite data, is a great supplement to on the ground like weather station data that gives us information on historical rainfall and temperature. In a lot of parts of the world, that those kind of data are not particularly robust. You just don't have a lot of weather stations, or they're not in good repair, or the information is not being collected regularly. So with a limited number of ground stations, for example, combined with some satellite technology, you can get a pretty good picture of what's going on at a given time. And then, you can project those data into the future to look at, downscaled climate projections in a particular area. So we use that kind of technology. We also just use a tremendous amount of data in terms of layering, our analysis, climate data plus economic data plus social data, health data, and together, those combined data sets can give us a pretty good picture of what's going on in a particular sector, in a particular community, and with respect to particular factors like, we did a tremendous amount of work recently in cooperation with USAID, looking at malaria incidents in sub-Saharan Africa. And in that case, we use a lot of health data in particular countries to correlate that with climate data to get a sense of what malaria incidence is going to look like in the future in particular parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that that kind of analysis can be extremely useful for USAID and other donors and national governments to plan their interventions in terms of malaria control and elimination. And it's also applicable to other types of infectious disease, particularly vector-borne disease carried by parasites like mosquitoes.
Chris, it's so interesting to see how Chemonics is using local information and culture to weave into dealing with this issue of climate. Jamie, I want to ask you a little bit about USAID and prioritizing climate change. It's a global humanitarian issue. How is USAID approaching it in the form of development work?
So I think, So for USAID, I mean, we are definitely, we view no challenge that poses a greater existential threat to our planet than climate change. So, in response, this is a huge priority for our administration and for USAID. And so we're definitely, ramping up our programming, our partnerships, our ambition to address climate change. This is going to be evident in our forthcoming climate strategy, which acknowledges that climate change touches every part of USAID's portfolio, from governance and economic growth to food and water security, health, human rights and conflict, et cetera. And so you can expect to hear quite a bit more about our commitment during COP26, which is starting next week. And so I think just to clarify the question, if you'd like to, I can give you some examples of what adaptation programming looks like in practice, if that's something that would be useful.
Yeah, sure. How exactly is USAID thinking of climate change within the organization?
Well, as I mentioned, we partner with countries around the world at all levels to build local capacity to better predict and prepare for climate shocks and stresses, to minimize loss, to reduce vulnerability, and particularly among those who are disproportionately affected by climate change. And so we're really hoping that, with our adaptation work, we're trying to reduce some of these climate pressures that might lead to displacement and forced migration. And so, what does that look like in practice for some of our adaptation programming? I can give an example in Indonesia where we supported work that helped to strengthen capacity at multiple scales by integrating adaptation and disaster risk reduction into national and subnational governance structures, supported local communities and the private sector to address climate change impacts and really tailor climate information tools and services for those that are on the front lines of adaptation and disaster response. And so really key to doing that was closely collaborating with those local partners. So with the national and local governments, with the communities and the households on the ground, and really engaging the stakeholders in ongoing discussions about what are these risks that they're facing, what are their priorities and their adaptation solutions that they want to put into place to really work to establish that foundation of trust and commitment and collaboration to really, I think get at those successful adaptation results that we're hoping to see. And then, in another example, which I think also touches a bit on some of the data uses of data that Chris referenced, we've done a lot of work in the dryland areas in Ethiopia to really support the increase the capacity of communities to respond to climate change by bringing together those government officials, traditional institutions, and the community representatives to really more effectively improve their management of water resources and grazing land. And in particular, one of those uses of data was to actually provide satellite maps of grazing land. So using vegetative greenness to pastoralists. So creating maps that were either available in their communities or downloaded to their phones. And so they could use that sort of real-time information to then make choices about where to go to bring their cattle to for grazing land. And so I think that was a real innovative use of using satellite and other data to make these important decisions.
It's always interesting to hear how technology is being used in all of this. Justin, I've got a question from Maria Rose at MIT who's asking, given that there is no existing structure to legally address climate refugees and that migration can at times be temporary, how do you accurately predict and track where populations are moving and for how long? And what might be the consequences of mischaracterizing the numbers of people moving?
Well, there's quite a lot packed into that great question.
There is.
So first of all, as with any forecasting model, one needs to have quite a good amount of historical data against which to validate and tune any kind of prediction before you can then use it in that kind of prognostic manner. And then there's a communications aspect to it, which is that when one is reporting on the findings of one's model or communicating the output of one's model, one has to be very transparent about the limitations in order to manage the expectations of people who are interacting with these outputs or who may be taking decisions based on the evidence that one is generating, because there's a real risk to the entire community that the misuse of a model can delegitimize or undermine faith in the entire enterprise, which is something that many of us in this modeling community work really hard to avoid. So then that also brings us to the other aspect of the question, which is about some of the more spatial and temporal dimensions to migration and displacement. And at the moment, because there is no one-stop shop solution for all of the data one would need on the different aspects of these phenomena, we're using what are non-traditional sources of data. So for instance, data from mobile phone users, anonymized and aggregated, of course, or data from social media networks about where users turn up before, during, and after an event has occurred, and then through follow-up surveys to understand who these people are once they've been displaced, how long they've been displaced, what informed their decision-making about where to go, and when to return. And then that brings us to an entirely other aspect to the question, which is that, I guess it relates to something that Chris said earlier, which is, what's the problem we're trying to solve? and then what's the best way and most responsible way to solve it. And one way that's gaining a bit more traction at the moment through the use of artificial intelligence, particularly natural language processing and machine learning, is to look at unstructured data to really elicit what some of these patterns and trends might mean, and to elicit patterns from individual user stories. So rather than going in with a kind of a preformed hypothesis about why people are moving and then likely finding what one's looking for, one might be able to ask open-ended questions that elicit people's actual lived experiences and understanding of what decisions they took and when and how they understood them, and then to do this at a scale that allows for the data to speak for themselves and the human stories to speak for themselves, so that we have a more refined and human understanding of how these patterns arise. And that's something that's only relatively recently been possible through advances in in supercomputing and in artificial intelligence. But I think the main takeaway, I guess, from my response here is that we're still in the early days of this. The modeling is in its relative infancy. It needs a lot more validation and work. So there's plenty of opportunities to improve for anyone interested in this topic. Thanks.
That's great. Yeah, that's so important. We acknowledge it's hard. We want to see great progress, but we are in the early days. And I know we're so eager to see more advancement. Chris, I want to give you the final word in our last few seconds we have left. What do you think is needed for governments and partners to ensure that developmental priorities for climate adaptation and migration is happening, that there's action being taken?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to begin with, I think even before you get to looking at migration itself and making that as orderly and systematic as possible, whether it's desirable or not, I think the first sort of line of defense is adaptation, so that people can stay in place, assuming they want to stay where they are, that they otherwise want to remain within their communities, their cultures, maintain their economic livelihood, et cetera. And so in order to do that, governments need capacity. I mean, we always talk about capacity, but capacity in the climate information and analysis space is really critical, and coordination between the entities in a particular country that are sort of the apex entities for looking at climate, and then the sectoral entities, whether that's the Ministry of Agriculture or Health or Economic Growth, et cetera. Coordination between them so that there's data sharing, so that decision making is done in coordination is really important. So having the capacity to do that and the systems to do that is key. And then the other thing, of course, is money. We just hear these astronomical numbers that are going to be required in order for us to deal with climate change. And yeah, that's true, but a lot of it is getting access to money that's already there, that's ready to be deployed to address climate change. And frankly, it can be really a Byzantine process for a lot of entities, whether those are national governments, municipal governments, et cetera, to access those resources, whether they're grant resources from international funds like the Green Climate Fund or from the private sector. So putting in place systems that help demystify that process so that they can get access to those resources is really a critical path to solving the problems here.
Yeah, access to resources, so important. Chris, I want to thank you. I want to thank Jamie, and I want to thank Justin. Unfortunately, we've got to leave it there. There's so much more on this front, and especially in the coming days. We're going to be paying close attention to the upcoming negotiations, hopefully tangible actions that'll come out of COP26, starting in a few days in Glasgow. I want to thank all of you again, and a big thanks also to Chemonics for supporting this event. And thank you to all of you for tuning in and engaging us. I want to let you know, if you're curious about some of the other events that FP, and I want to thank the FP events team for always doing such a great job in finding the right experts. Be sure to check out, you can get the full recording of this event at foreignpolicy.com/events. You can also sign up to get on their email list to learn more also about upcoming events. So be sure to check that out, because that'll have both the recording and an opportunity to sign up. On November 10th, there's crypto's impact on global finance. We're gonna have a look at digital money and how you can build a more inclusive economy. November 17th, FP is going to host an inaugural tech forum looking at technology's impact on the world and its influence on society and geopolitics and global business, and some of the challenges and opportunities technology brings in international affairs. And then in December 1st and 2nd is going to be Food Plus Summit, which is now in its 3rd year. We're going to look at some of the world's leading thinkers and doers at the nexus of agriculture, food security, and climate change. So there's some incredibly great events. Again, stay tuned to foreignpolicy.com events. I want to thank all of you for joining us. I'm Rena Ninan, and I hope to see you soon.